Greetings, bibliophiles, and welcome to a bit of good old-fashioned history fiction. And the history fiction in this case is Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel. Now, you may have heard that name because there was a BBC adaptation, which I haven't watched. I think I probably will at some point in the near future, now I've read the source novel. But if it's even half as good, then it might well be worth it. I might even do a separate, there might be a TV episode that pops up. So, broadly speaking, it's about Henry VIII. And we all know about Henry VIII, right? Henry VIII, 8 wives, divorced some, beheaded a bunch of others, and there was one, or was it? I can't remember. There's like one that outlived him, but she wasn't the only surviving one, because some others managed to get away with not being beheaded, which is quite a good trick if you can manage it. So basically, we all know the broad facts, Henry VIII, and maybe some of us know a little bit more than that, but when you actually look at the history in more detail, you go into it just beyond that surface layer of, oh, Henry VIII, he was a bit of a lad, wasn't he? Or Henry VIII, he was a bit of a tyrant, wasn't he? Of course, naturally, things get a bit more complicated, and you maybe start to slightly get some idea of quite how momentous all these events were. And there's a reason why historians, I suppose, a bit, because it must be a fascinating period as a historian, but particularly writers just really gravitate towards this particular period, because there's some really fascinating stuff going on with not just the actual, like the legalistic history, as it were, but also the personalities involved and the motivations involved. And for historians, guessing at people's motivations is maybe a bit more tricky, but for writers, well, they've got a bit more leeway, because writers generally are in the business of making stuff up. Writers of fiction, anyway. Now, historical fiction is usually in that tricky position of you can get away with some things but not others, depending on the exact nature of the historical fiction. Sometimes it's just kind of generic, like if it's sort of generic, Roman background or 18th century England or whatever, then you can get away with potentially quite a lot, so long as you've done your research and whatever. But things have to be even more in place if you are being a bit more biographically focused, if you're focusing on actual people and using them as the characters to populate your book. And that always presents a particular challenge. Now, another writer of historical fiction I particularly like is Lindsay Davis, and she actually has quite a long-running series at this point set in ancient Rome at around about, I think the earliest novel's 69 AD, and then it covers a couple of years after that with the amount she's written at this point. Although it incorporates some actual historical figures that we know about, up to and including the Emperor Vespasian, who was the emperor at that point, it's more or less largely fictional in terms of the characters. But Lindsay Davis definitely knows the stuff as the actual background. But of course, we can look at the fact that it's so far away from us in time and say, well, at least some of this, a good portion of this has to be imagination. It has to be conjured up from within the author's mind, bearing whatever else they know about the history and the period. And so undoubtedly an actual Roman reading one of these, presuming it had been translated into Latin or whatever, would go, oh, that's wrong, and that's wrong, and that's completely wrong, and that's wrong, and that's wrong. Because, there's all the little details of life that just largely get lost through the wash of time. So although Wolf Hall is a bit closer, we can never really get away from the fact that although it is very well grounded in the history and the records that we do have, ultimately it's fiction. It's a work of imagination. It must, by necessity, be a work of imagination. And particularly as the main focus of the book, it's set in and around the court of Henry VIII, but the main focus of the book is a character, or a person I should say, who is really quite enigmatic in a way. Thomas Cromwell, who rose to become the Lord Chancellor of England. And again, you can see why he's an interesting character for the writer in particular, because he was a commoner. He was a nobody. He had no kind of like aristocratic connections or anything. He was just was it a blacksmith's son? I can't remember exactly, but he's like just nobody, and he rises to this position of incredible power. And he actually follows on from another interesting character, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey. There's a lot of Thomases that are in this book that were around in Henry's court, clearly, who also was a complete commoner, but he rose up through the church, and that was rather a different thing in those days. The church, well, it's hard to say it was egalitarian, but it was maybe more feasible and more possible, and it would have seemed less outlandish to the people of this point in the 16th century, of somebody of that low birth, as it were, rising up to be a cardinal of the realm and an archbishop to boot. So the fact that Cromwell comes up through Wolsey's court and then ends up becoming the Lord Chancellor of England, it's just it's like you just look back at it and you think, oh yeah, okay, that's kind of interesting, but there's so much of the kind of the surface that you look at it, and it really is looking back at it as we do, that you don't get that feel for the true depth of a lot of what these things must have meant. And it's the mark of a good writer that they can go back and they can bring that depth, and they can bring out that life and that colour, and really give you a sense of the import of certain things. Like I mean, going back to what I said about Henry, he's a bit of a lad. The actual, like, the stuff that came about because of Henry wanting to get that divorce from Catherine of Aragon changed the face of Britain forever. Like this was one of the pivotal moments of English history, or British history, really. So, as we do now live in the shadow of Brexit, I can only imagine it must have been like that, but even more so, because this was about people's souls. This was about, whether or not you're going to get into heaven or hell. And that mattered a great deal in that period. It still matters a great deal to some people today. But the way that church and state were very much more intertwined than they are now, it was not only a matter of personal salvation, it was a matter of extreme political importance and international political importance. And it's only once you start to see it on the ground level that you start to maybe think about it in that way. Because if you're just looking back on it as a piece of history, it's like your eyes glance over it and that's it, and you might think, oh, that's interesting, or maybe you think about it a bit more and you pick up some of the implications. But one of the things that a writer can do, the writer's prerogative with the imagination they can put into it, and the license they have, is to really bring out what this would have meant to people of the time, to really I'm kind of dancing around the edge. I'm struggling to get across what I mean. Maybe if I come at it from a different tack. There's a little an interview that's republished from like The Guardian or somewhere in the back of the edition that I've got. And basically, Hilary Mantel said a bunch of stuff about, Cromwell's interesting because we don't know that much about him. We've got a bunch of very kind of dry technical documents almost, like dockets and law documents, and we've got Acts of Parliament, and we've got inventory and notes, but we have very little biographical information about the man. And so she was trying to come at it from from that level, trying to flesh out this character that in other depictions of this particular story, I mean, Wolf Hall covers in particular the divorce from Catherine of Aragon and Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn, which is, it's one of those things, I broadly know the history, but I hadn't realised quite how long that process took. It was years. It was the better part of a decade. And so what Hilary Mantel was trying to do through the whole thing was not to make this seem like something that you're looking back on. She absolutely set out from the start to make it something that these people are living through, and they don't know what's going to happen. For them, this is now. This is the present. This is, the uncertainty of all of these momentous things going on, where we don't know how things are going to turn out. We don't know how the chips are going to fall, which is why I kind of brought Brexit in there, because that's another thing where we don't know how this is going to work out ultimately. But it's also possibly maybe a little more like the implications are different than the events of Wolf Hall. So it's a big challenge. It's a really tall order to do that effectively and make a good narrative. And it does. It's a really good book. I mean, just as a piece of fiction, just the prose, it's cracking stuff. It really is. I haven't enjoyed a book this much in quite a little while. I'm trying to think the last thing I read that really did, like, I'm not going to say this was a massive page turner, because for me it wasn't that kind of a book. It took me about 3 months or so to get through Wolf Hall, and it's not especially a small book, but it's just the richness of the prose and the sympathy with which she depicts all the characters. At no point are any of these people portrayed as being anything less than fully complicated, frail, imperfect human beings, up to and including Henry himself. And if you didn't know the history of what's to come, it would be like, if this was just a complete act of fiction and none of this was based on real life, it would still be a very good book. But to look back at all these actual people that lived and to try and imbue them with and again, complete act of imagination, but with some people she will have had better sources to understand their personalities than others. But it really is, it's masterfully done, and it just brings the whole thing alive in a way that even a really interestingly written history book couldn't do, because historians are coming at things from a different angle, and historians, generally speaking, don't like to make stuff up in the way that writers can get away with. But for what is there, and we know, the central character himself, Cromwell, as I've said, we know relatively little about him. So that is a complete act of imagination. It's one of those things where you have to read around the edges of all the other the documents and biographical whatevers that maybe mention him or touch on his life or whatever, and just looking at the circumstances as well, and you can maybe use that as a starting basis. But there's stuff in there that we can't know for a fact is true, but she uses it to bring out this interesting, complex, ambitious character. And that's one of the things that you can look at the history of Thomas Cromwell and you can say, yeah, he must have been ambitious. You don't get up to be the Lord Chancellor of England by accident. That took some calculation. That took some real political manoeuvring. Now, there is another work of fiction that particularly concerns this period, and it's one I actually watched more or less at the same time as I was finishing the book, and it's originally a play, but then a film adaptation, A Man for All Seasons, which is much more concerned with Thomas More. Now, More is a really major figure in Wolf Hall because his refusal to basically take the oath acknowledging the legality of everything that Henry had done, essentially, ended up dooming him. And he's sometimes held up as this man of principle against all the odds. But again, Wolf Hall takes the more complicated view, and it still paints a somewhat sympathetic picture of More, but it also, in places, it's not afraid to imagine some flaws and point out some flaws that we know about. And one of the things that A Man for All Seasons completely glosses over, I mean, it's a fine film, and I'm sure the stage adaptation is very good as well. I've not seen a whole lot of plays in my life. Don't get the opportunity out here in the wilds of Scotland. But it completely just omits all of More's dealings with refugees from the continent, or even people in England that he considered to be heretical. And More was not afraid of having people tortured or executed even, and sometimes in really quite horrible ways. We're not talking about sending them off to the guillotine for a nice quick death. No, we're talking about burning people alive, sometimes agonizingly slowly. And considering Thomas More's own eventual end, it was comparatively merciful compared to some of the deaths he inflicted on other people. So yes, he was a man of principle, but he also went around executing people in really horrible ways, not to mention all the torture. And it's the kind of detail that something like A Man for All Seasons is happy to skip over because it's telling a particular story and it doesn't want any complicating details. Wolf Hall is all about the complicating details because it's aiming for that verite, it's aiming for that feel of real life. It's aiming to make these people feel like living, breathing, people you might meet out on the street. Well, not exactly, but it aims to not just make it feel like a bunch of characters moving around on a stage and here's the moral at the end of it all. So, it's a really good book, and it's won at least one prize. I think it won the Man Booker. It might have won some other prizes around as well, or at least certainly it'll have been nominated. It's also the first part of a trilogy, which one presumes will end with the eventual death of Thomas Cromwell. And I was fortunate enough, I bought Wolf Hall in a charity shop. I was fortunate enough a couple of weeks ago, literally just a couple of weeks ago, to be going past one of the local charity shops. Just thought I'd pop in, see what was on their bookshelves, which I quite frequently do when I'm out and about. And lo and behold, there was the sequel, Bring Up the Bodies, just on a shelf. So I don't even have to go away and order it specifically. It was right there for like 50 pence for the hardback. So that was quite a nice find. There is a third one obviously coming around because it's going to be a trilogy, but as far as I know, she hasn't actually finished it yet, so we're going to have to wait a little bit for that one. So, I've mentioned the prose a little bit. There's one of the minor characters, and it's hard to know whether to call them characters or people because they are largely based on real people, but also in the context of the book, they are characters. She's had to imagine a lot of stuff for them. One of them is Hans Holbein, who's quite a well-known portrait painter who was around various places in Europe, but he ended up in Henry's court in the latter part of his life, for part of the latter part of his life anyway. And he's a fairly well-known oil painter, and I think the context of oil painting is quite but it lets me make an analogy because the prose in this book, it's largely it's kind of this first person ish, but not really I don't know what to describe it as exactly, but it has a certain quality about it. It's very rich, dark, heavy stuff, and the oil painting comes into it because on oil painting you can see all the heavy brush strokes and the ridges of the paint, and it has that feeling, but with words, if that makes any kind of sense. At least I hope it does. So the passage I've chosen is a little, I don't know, a little reminiscence on the part of Thomas Cromwell when he's thinking back to his childhood, because the book actually starts off with a little bit of, and I imagine largely made up because we don't know much about him, a slice of his home life as a boy, and this kind of harkens back to that very early chapter. When he was a little boy and his Uncle John was a cook for the great man, he used to run away to Lambeth to the palace because the chances of getting fed were better. He used to hang around by the entrance nearest the river. Morton hadn't built his big gateway then, and watch the people come and go, asking who was who, and recognise them next time by the colours of their clothes and the animals and objects painted on their shields. "Don't stand about," people bellowed at him. "Make yourself useful." Other children than he had made themselves useful in the kitchen by fetching and carrying, their small fingers employed in plucking songbirds and hulling strawberries. Each dinner time, the household officers formed up in procession in the passages off the kitchens, and they carried in the tablecloths and the principal salt. His Uncle John measured the loaves, and if they were not just right, they were tossed into a basket for the lower household. Those that passed his test he counted as they went in. Standing by him, pretending to be his deputy, he learned to count. Into the great hall would go the meats and the cheeses, the sugared fruits and the spiced wafers to the Archbishop's table. He was not a cardinal then. When the scrapings and remnants came back, they were divided up. First choice to the kitchen staff, then to the almshouse and the hospital, the beggars at the gate, and what wasn't fit for them would go down the line to the children and the pigs. Each morning and evening the boys earned their keep by running up the back staircases with beer and bread to put in the cupboards for the young gentlemen who were the cardinal's pages. The pages were of good family. They would wait at table and so become intimate with great men. They would hear their talk and learn from it. When they were not at the table, they were learning out of great volumes from their music masters and other masters, who passed up and down the house holding nosegays and pomanders, who spoke in Greek. One of the pages was pointed out to him, Master Thomas More, whom the Archbishop himself says will be a great man, so deep his learning already, and so pleasant his wit. One day he bought a wheaten loaf and put it in the cupboard and lingered, and Master Thomas said, "Why do you linger?" But he did not throw anything at him. "What is in that great book?" he asked, and Master Thomas replies, smiling, "Words, words, just words." "Master More is 14 this year," someone says, and is to go to Oxford. He doesn't know where Oxford is, or whether he wants to go there, or has just been sent. A boy can be sent, and Master Thomas is not yet a man. 14 is twice 7. "Am I 7?" he asks. "Don't just say yes. Tell me, am I?" His father says, "For God's sake, Cat, make him up a birthday. Tell him anything, but keep him quiet." When his father says, "I'm sick of the sight of you," he leaves Putney and sets off to Lambeth. When Uncle John says, "We have plenty of boys this week, and the devil finds work for idle hands," he sends him off back to Putney. Sometimes he gets a present to take home. Sometimes it's a brace of pigeons with their feet tied together and gaping bloody beaks. He walks along the river bank, whirling them about his head, and they look as if they are flying, till somebody shouts at him, "Stop that!" He can't do anything without somebody shouting. "Is it any wonder," John says, "when you're into any mischief going, prone to giving back answers and always reliably to be found where you shouldn't be?" In a small cold room off the kitchen passages, there is a woman called Isabella who makes marzipan figures for the Archbishop and his friends to make plays with after supper. Some of the figures are heroes, such as Prince Alexander, Prince Caesar. Some are saints. "Today I'm making St. Thomas," she says. One day she makes marzipan beasts and gives him a lion. "You can eat it," she says. He would rather keep it, but Isabella says it will soon fall to pieces. She says, "Haven't you got a mother?" He learns to read from the scribbled orders for wheat flour or dried beans, for barley and for ducks' eggs that come out of the steward's pantries, For Walter, that's his father, the point of being able to read is to take advantage of people who can't. For the same purpose, one must learn to write. So his father sends him to the priest. But again, he's always in the wrong, for priests have such strange rules. He should come to the lessons specially, not on his way from whatever else he's doing, not carrying a toad in a bag or knives that want sharpening, and not cut or bruised either from one of those doors called Walter, that he's always walking into. The priest shouts and forgets to feed him, so he takes off back to Lambeth again. On the days when he turns up in Putney, his father says, "Where by the sweet saints have you been?" Unless he's busy inside, on top of a stepmother. Some of the stepmothers last such a short time that his father's done with them and kicked them out by the time he gets home, but Cat and Bet tell him about them, screeching with laughter. Once, when he comes in, dirty and wet, that day's stepmother says, "Who does this boy belong to?" and tries to kick him out into the yard. One day, when he's nearly home, he finds the first Bella lying in the street, and he sees nobody wants her. She's no longer than a small-sized rat, and so shocked and cold that she doesn't even cry. He carries her home in one hand, and in the other a small cheese wrapped in sage leaves. The dog dies. His sister Bet says, "You can get another." He looks in the street, but never finds one. There are dogs, but they belong to somebody. It can take a long time to get to Putney from Lambeth, and sometimes he eats the present if it's not raw. But if he only gets a cabbage, he kicks it and rolls it and thrashes it till it is utterly, utterly destroyed. At Lambeth, he follows the stewards around, and when they say a number, he remembers it. So people say, if you haven't time to write it down, just tell John's nephew. He will cast an eye on the sack of whatever's been ordered in, and then warn his uncle to check it if it's short weight. At night at Lambeth, when it's still light and the pots have been scoured, the boys go outside on the cobbles and play at football. Their shouts rise into the air. They curse and barge into each other until somebody yells to stop. They fight with their fists and sometimes bite each other. From the open window above, the young gentlemen sing a part song in the high, careful voices they learn. Sometimes the face of Master Thomas More appears. He waves to him, but Master Thomas looks down without recognition at the children below. He smiles impartially. His white scholar's hand draws close the shutter. The moon rises. The pages go to their truckle beds. The kitchen children wrap themselves in sacking and sleep by the hearth. He remembers one night in summer when the footballers had stood silent, looking up. It was dusk. The note from a single recorder wavered in the air, thin and piercing. A blackbird picked up the note and sang from a bush by the watergate. A boatman whistled back from the river. So, there's one thing in that passage that we know definitively is true. He had an uncle called John who was a cook for Archbishop Morton at Lambeth Palace. And so, knowing that More was also there, educated there, at least for the earliest part of his life, Hilary Mantel's just, taken with this and run with it, and supposed that even in these early days, they had run into each other, and it's all kinds of full of looking back at it, having read the novel, it's full of all kinds of allegorical imagery for stuff that is to come. So absolutely it is an act of imagination, but it's such a lovely one, and it's nice to imagine that some of what she has imagined may even be true, but of course we can never know that. In a way, the fact that the picture is so incomplete for Thomas More in particular, it might pose more of a challenge for the historian than for the writer, because yes, it would be maybe nicer from the point of view of somebody sitting down to try and write such a novel to know a bit more about who a person was. If they're this kind of blank slate, it almost gives you more scope to impose your own imagination and to have a bit more leeway. But I suppose it really does come down to the kind of the intent when you put pen to paper as to what kind of a book you want this to be. Something like, to throw in a complete sideways reference, the series The Tudors. That's the complete soap opera version of this history. Although it did have some pretty good actors in it, but in terms of historical accuracy, it's a little bit iffy, just a little bit. It takes one or two liberties. Now, that's not to say this, of course, doesn't also take some liberties of imagination, but the intent is wildly different. And I think that's the key thing here, is that although this is a very well-treaded piece of history, the intent that Hilary Mantel's come at it from, or come at it with rather, and the scope of her story, the acts of imagination that have gone into it, they all just tie up very nicely in this very Hans Holbeinian oil portrait, full of lovely lines and texture and colour and light. So, yeah, it's a good book, is what I'm trying to say. And once I've sat down and read the second of the trilogy, and once she's published the third, I shall be very eagerly reading those as well. Even though I know all too well the fate of Thomas Cromwell, it's still going to be interesting going on that journey with him to get there. So, this was a bit of a rambling one, but I don't know, I just had a lot of thoughts about this book, and it was hard to marshal them into some kind of order. So, here they are, in probably not so much any kind of order, but hopefully you found it interesting anyway. And as usual, if you did, you can hit the like button to show your appreciation. You can leave any comments below. You can sub to this or my main channel if you haven't already. And as always, stay tuned for more.